They hired a homeless man to work at their restaurant, but 5 years later, they discovered he was actually their long-lost brother. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Richard Montgomery stared through the rain-streaked windows of his restaurant, counting empty tables with a growing knot in his stomach. Tuesday nights were never spectacular, but this was something else entirely. The place was a ghost town, 5 tables occupied out of 28. A year ago, they would have been turning people away, even on a miserable Tuesday in October. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass like a reminder of all his mounting problems. Richard ran a hand through his thinning hair, catching his reflection in the window. At 42, the lines around his eyes had deepened considerably over the past 6 months. The restaurant, Montgomery's, had been his dream for nearly a decade, the culmination of everything he'd worked for since culinary school. Now it teetered on the edge of collapse. "I've got numbers you need to see," Jessica said, appearing suddenly beside him. Jessica Chen had been his restaurant manager for 5 years, outlasting 2 head chefs and countless servers. Her usual perfect posture had a subtle slump these days, the strain of keeping the place afloat showing on her normally composed features. "That bad?" Richard asked, already knowing the answer. Jessica laid a folder on the nearest empty table, opening it to reveal meticulously organized spreadsheets. "We're behind on the produce payments. Alvarez is threatening to cut us off if we don't clear the balance by Friday." She flipped to another page. "And the bank called about the loan payment." Richard winced. "How long can we stay open like this?" "6 weeks. 8 if we cut staff hours even further." Her voice softened. "Richard, we're already operating with a skeleton crew. The timing couldn't have been worse." The rain-slicked door to the kitchen swung open, and Anthony, their head chef, burst through with his white coat already unbuttoned. "We need to talk," Anthony said, his voice tight with poorly concealed anger. Richard nodded to Jessica, who tactfully gathered her spreadsheets and retreated to the office. Anthony had been with Montgomery's for 2 years, talented but temperamental, with an ego that had grown increasingly difficult to manage. "I can't work like this anymore," Anthony said, keeping his voice low but intense. "I'm a James Beard semi-finalist, and you've got me working with frozen scallops because we can't afford fresh. My reputation is on the line every night." "It's temporary, Anthony. Things will turn around." "You've been saying that for months," Anthony interrupted. "I've had an offer from Lumiere. Executive chef position, creative control, 30% more than what you're paying me." Richard felt the floor shift beneath him. "You're leaving?" It wasn't a question. 2 weeks' notice, Anthony confirmed, already backing toward the door. "I'm sorry, Richard, I really am." The kitchen door swung closed behind him, leaving Richard alone with the sound of rain and the quiet murmur of the few remaining diners. His head chef was leaving. His restaurant was failing, and he had no idea how to fix either problem. The next morning, Richard arrived hours before opening, determined to salvage what he could from the wreckage. With Anthony already mentally checked out, Richard donned his rarely used chef's coat and began prep work himself. The familiar rhythm of chopping, measuring, and mixing provided a temporary refuge from his financial anxieties. "You can't keep doing this," Jessica said, finding him elbow-deep in bechamel sauce at noon. "You need a chef, Richard." "We need to cut costs, not add them," Richard replied, trying to focus on the consistency of the sauce. Jessica leaned against the stainless steel counter. "So your plan is to run the restaurant and be the head chef until we magically start turning a profit again? Got a better idea?" "Sell while we still have something to sell." Richard's hand tightened around the whisk. "This restaurant is all I have, Jess. It's not just a business." "I know," she said softly. "But you need to be practical. At minimum, you need kitchen help. You can't do this alone, regardless of what happens with the restaurant." By evening service, Richard's back ached, His feet throbbed, and they'd had to apologize to 3 different tables for delays. Jessica was right. He needed help in the kitchen immediately. But Anthony's salary had been substantial, and replacing him with someone even remotely as qualified was financially impossible. At 10:30, with the last tables finally cleared, Richard dragged himself to the back alley to dispose of the day's garbage. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the autumn air had a biting chill. As he heaved the first bag into the dumpster, a movement in the shadows caught his eye. A figure hunched near the back of the alley, methodically going through a cardboard box that contained discarded food containers. Despite the dimness, Richard could make out an elderly man with wild gray hair, wearing what had once been a decent jacket, now patched and weathered. Richard's first instinct was to shout, to chase the man away. This wasn't the first time he'd found someone rummaging through the restaurant's trash, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was exhaustion or the weight of his own precarious situation, but Richard found himself setting down the garbage bag instead. "Hey!" he called, his voice softer than he'd intended. The man jerked upright with surprising agility, clutching a half-empty container of risotto to his chest. He didn't run, though. Instead, he straightened his posture with remarkable dignity, revealing a lean face, weathered by years of hard living, but marked by striking blue eyes that seemed oddly familiar. "Evening," the man replied, his voice unexpectedly cultured despite his ragged appearance. "Didn't mean to disturb you." Richard surprised himself with his next question. "Ever worked in a restaurant?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying Richard with an intensity that felt strangely penetrating. "I've done my time in kitchens, yes." "What positions?" "Started as dishwasher, worked up to line cook, some sous chef work." The man carefully set down the risotto container. "Why do you ask?" Richard wasn't entirely sure himself. "I'm short-staffed, need help in the kitchen." A flicker of something, amusement, interest, crossed the man's face. "You're offering me a job, just like that?" "Just like that," Richard confirmed, surprising himself with his certainty. "Pay's not great. Hours are long, but it's actual food instead of leftovers, and it's inside instead of—" He gestured vaguely at the damp alley. The man considered for a long moment before extending a hand. "Name's Frank." Richard shook the offered hand, noting both its strength and the calluses that suggested Frank wasn't lying about kitchen experience. "Richard Montgomery. The place is called Montgomery's." "Fitting," Frank replied with the ghost of a smile. Jessica's reaction the next morning was predictably explosive. "You did what?" she hissed, pulling Richard into the tiny office at the back of the restaurant. "You hired a homeless man you found digging through our garbage? Have you completely lost your mind?" "He has experience," Richard said defensively. "Does he have references? ID? A food handler's permit? A permanent address? Clean clothes?" Jessica countered, ticking points off on her fingers. Richard had no good answers, only a gut feeling he couldn't articulate. "There's something about him, Jess. I can't explain it." "That's not exactly reassuring." Jessica massaged her temples. "We're barely staying afloat, and you bring in a complete unknown who could potentially drive away what few customers we have left. He's starting as dishwasher and prep. Customers won't even see him." "Until he steals everything that isn't nailed down," Jessica muttered. Richard was saved from further argument by a knock on the office door. Frank stood there looking remarkably transformed. He'd clearly found a way to shower. His gray hair was combed back, and though his clothes were worn, they were clean. More striking was his demeanor. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the circumstances in which Richard had found him. "I can come back later if you're busy," Frank offered. Jessica gave Richard a final warning look before stalking past Frank. "He's all yours." The first week with Frank passed without incident. He showed up on time, worked tirelessly, and displayed a precise attention to detail that impressed even the skeptical Jessica. Richard noticed that Frank seemed to be observing everything. The way dishes were prepared, plated, seasoned, absorbing the restaurant's systems with quiet intensity. On the 10th day, Richard discovered something unexpected. While working the line during dinner service, he reached for a sauce that tasted subtly different. Deeper, more complex, with a perfect balance of acidity. He glanced up to see Frank watching him from the dishwashing station, a flicker of anticipation in those piercing blue eyes. "Did you adjust this sauce?" Richard asked, caught between irritation and curiosity. Frank hesitated. "It needed more depth. I added a reduction I made from the mushroom stems that were being discarded." Instead of anger, Richard felt a strange sensation of déjà vu. The technique was one his mother had used, a memory so distant he'd almost forgotten it. Before he could pursue the thought, a commotion erupted in the dining room. A red-faced man was berating a young server, his voice carrying through the entire restaurant. "This is medium well. It's practically mooing. And you call this a fine dining establishment?" The server, barely 20 and new to the job, was blinking back tears. Richard moved toward the dining room, but Frank was faster. He emerged from the kitchen with a presence that seemed to expand to fill the space. "Sir," Frank addressed the irate customer with unexpected authority, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding with your steak. If you'll allow me, I'd be delighted to have our chef prepare a replacement to your exact specifications. Meanwhile, might I suggest a complimentary glass of our Cabernet? It's particularly exceptional this evening." The customer, clearly thrown by Frank's dignified intervention, settled back into his seat. "Well, yes, that would be acceptable." Richard stood frozen, watching as Frank effortlessly defused the situation with a charm and confidence that seemed completely at odds with the man he'd found digging through garbage less than 2 weeks ago. Later that night, as they closed the restaurant, Richard observed Frank meticulously cleaning the kitchen, his movements efficient and practiced. As Frank reached up to put away a stack of clean pots, his sleeve pulled back, revealing a jagged scar that curved around his left wrist. Something about the distinctive shape of that scar sent a jolt of recognition through Richard so powerful that he nearly dropped the glass he was drying. "How did you get that?" Richard asked, his voice unsteady. Frank quickly pulled his sleeve down, a shadow crossing his face. "Accidents of childhood are best forgotten," he said, turning away to scrub an already spotless counter with sudden intensity. Richard continued watching Frank, a growing uneasiness settling in his stomach. That scar was identical to one his brother had. A brother who had disappeared from his life over 30 years ago, when they were both still children. The resemblance couldn't be coincidence, could it? But Frank was too old, surely, to be Franklin, who would only be in his late 40s now. Yet, as Richard observed Frank's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when concentrating, the precise movements of his hands, a long-buried memory struggled to surface. A memory of another kitchen, another time, and 2 boys learning to cook at their mother's side before tragedy tore their world apart. Richard absently traced the outline of the scar on his own wrist as the morning light filtered through his kitchen window. The jagged line, faded with time but still unmistakable, traced a crescent from the base of his palm halfway to his elbow. He hadn't thought about that day in years, the day he and Franklin had tried to build a treehouse alone, the rusty nail that had caught them both as they fell. "Identical scars," he murmured, stirring his coffee. "But it can't be him." Richard had been 8 when he lost his parents and was separated from his 16-year-old brother. The system had placed them in different homes, despite their desperate pleas to stay together. For years he'd searched, hired investigators, placed ads in newspapers across the country. Nothing. "You're seeing ghosts," he told himself firmly, grabbing his keys. Frank is just a homeless man with cooking skills and a similar scar. Yet as he drove to Montgomery's, doubt gnawed at him. Those blue eyes, that laugh when Richard had complimented his sauce adjustment, a laugh so hauntingly familiar it had made the hair on his arms stand up. When Richard arrived at the restaurant, Frank was already there, methodically organizing the walk-in refrigerator with a precision that spoke of years of kitchen experience. He had arranged the produce by type and expiration date, a system Richard's mother had always insisted upon. "Morning," Frank said without turning around. "Your vegetable delivery was missing the fennel. I called the supplier. They'll have it here by noon." Richard paused in the doorway, struck by the initiative. "Thanks, that's exactly what I would have done." "Common sense in a kitchen?" Frank replied with a shrug, but his eyes, when he finally turned, held a hint of something Richard couldn't quite place. Pride? Nostalgia? Jessica arrived an hour later, her usual stack of paperwork in hand, but her expression showed unexpected optimism as she settled at the small desk in Richard's office. "The numbers are better," she announced, sliding a spreadsheet toward him. "Not great, but better. Dinner service has been up 15% since last week." Richard scanned the figures. "That can't be right. We haven't changed anything." "Except hiring Frank," Jessica pointed out, her initial skepticism clearly wavering. "Table 7 last night specifically mentioned the sea bass sauce, said it reminded them of a restaurant they loved in France." The sauce Frank had adjusted. Richard felt that same uncanny sensation again, a memory just beyond his grasp. "Where did you find him again?" Jessica asked, studying Richard's troubled expression. "I told you, in the alley." "And you didn't think to ask for references or a last name?" Richard sighed. He needed a job. I needed help. It was instinct. "Your instincts might have saved us," Jessica admitted reluctantly. "But I still want to know more about him." Later that afternoon, during the lull between lunch and dinner service, Richard found Frank seasoning a batch of soup with a distinctive combination of herbs. The aroma transported Richard instantly to his childhood kitchen, his mother's special touch that had made her soups renowned among family and friends. "Where did you learn to do that?" Richard asked, the question emerging more sharply than he'd intended. Frank's hand stilled momentarily. "Pick up things here and there. Been cooking a long time. That specific combination, thyme, rosemary, and just a touch of fennel seed, is unusual." Frank turned away, wiping his hands on his apron. "Worked in a French restaurant years ago. Chef was particular about his herbs." The explanation was reasonable, yet Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was evading something. Before he could press further, his phone rang. An anonymous food critic was apparently dining at the restaurant that evening, according to a friend at another establishment. The news sent the kitchen into a controlled frenzy of preparation. Richard found himself working seamlessly with Frank, their movements around the kitchen complementing each other with an efficiency that felt strangely practiced. Frank seemed to anticipate Richard's needs before he vocalized them, handing him tools and ingredients at precisely the right moment. As dinner service progressed, Richard noticed Frank quietly modifying a sauce for the duck confit just before it went out to the suspected critic's table. Rather than intervene, he watched as Frank added a subtle dash of orange zest and a sprinkle of something Richard couldn't identify. The plate returned empty, with a request to compliment the chef. That night, Richard dreamed of Franklin. Not the teenager he'd last seen, but a young Franklin teaching him to flip pancakes in their family kitchen, laughing when Richard's attempt landed on the floor. He woke suddenly at 3 a.m., heart pounding, and found himself dialing the restaurant's number before he was fully conscious. Frank answered on the third ring. "Montgomery's. We're closed." "Frank, why are you at the restaurant?" Richard asked, relief mixing with confusion. A pause. "Prep work, couldn't sleep. Is something wrong?" "No, I just..." Richard hesitated. "Had a feeling something might be wrong at the restaurant." "Everything's fine," Frank assured him, his voice softening. "Go back to sleep, Richard." The use of his name, the tone, paternal, almost brotherly, sent another shiver of recognition through Richard. He hung up and lay awake until dawn, memories of his fractured childhood washing over him in waves. When Richard arrived at the restaurant the next morning, he found Frank alone in the kitchen studying the old family photographs Richard had hung years ago in his small office. Frank didn't hear him enter, and the raw emotion on his weathered face as he gazed at a picture of young Richard with his parents was unmistakable. Frank reached out, almost touching the glass of the frame, before quickly withdrawing his hand as if burned. Richard cleared his throat, and Frank startled, turning with an expression that rapidly shifted from vulnerability to careful neutrality. "Sorry," Frank mumbled. "Was looking for the inventory sheets." "In a picture frame?" Richard asked quietly. Frank shrugged, moving toward the door. "Got distracted. Nice family." "They died when I was 8, Richard said, watching Frank's reaction carefully. "Car accident. Had an older brother too, but we were separated after. Foster system." Frank's face remained impassive, but his hands, those sure, steady hands that moved so confidently in the kitchen, trembled slightly. "Tough break," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Excuse me, need to check on the deliveries." That evening, Melissa stopped by the restaurant for dinner, a rare occurrence since Emma had started high school, and their evenings became dominated by homework supervision and extracurricular shuttling. Richard's wife of 15 years had always been his emotional anchor, her steady pragmatism balancing his occasional flights of culinary fancy. "So this is the famous Frank I've been hearing about," she said, as Richard introduced them after service. "Richard says you've revolutionized the kitchen." Frank looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "Melissa, please," she corrected warmly. Over dinner in Richard's office, she observed, "There's something familiar about him. Has he worked with you before?" Richard hesitated. "No, but there's something I've been wondering." He lowered his voice. "Does he remind you of anyone?" Melissa studied her husband. "What's going on, Richard?" "He has the same scar on his wrist that Franklin had, the same blue eyes, and yesterday he seasoned a soup exactly like my mother used to." "Richard," Melissa said gently, reaching for his hand, "you've been looking for Franklin for 20 years. Don't you think you might be seeing what you want to see?" "You don't understand," Richard insisted. "It's not just the resemblance, it's the way he moves in the kitchen, like he belongs there, like he's been cooking alongside me for years." Melissa's expression softened with concern. "Frank looks at least 65, honey. Franklin would only be 48 now." Richard's argument died on his lips. She was right, of course. The age difference was impossible to reconcile. Frank's weathered appearance, his gray hair, he was much too old to be Franklin. The next morning, a regular customer in his 70s commented on the remarkable improvement in the food as Richard checked on his table. "Reminds me of how my mother cooked," the man said appreciatively. "Whoever's added the old-school touches knows what they're doing." Richard smiled. "That would be Frank, our new kitchen addition." The elderly man squinted toward the kitchen. "Frank, eh? Good man. Has your eyes, you know. Family resemblance is strong." The comment lingered with Richard throughout the day. During the lunch rush, he found himself watching Frank more closely, noticing how he gently corrected a young line cook's technique for cutting onions, the exact same correction Richard's father had once given him. "Not up and down, son. Roll the knife forward like this." When Frank said son to the young cook with that particular inflection, Richard nearly dropped the plate he was garnishing. Later that afternoon, as they prepped for dinner service, Richard deliberately broached the subject of the scar again. "That's a distinctive mark you have there," he said, nodding toward Frank's wrist as they chopped vegetables side by side. "I have a similar one. Childhood accident with a rusty nail." Frank's knife paused momentarily before resuming its steady rhythm. "As I said, accidents of childhood are best forgotten." His tone suggested the conversation was closed. "My brother had the same scar," Richard continued, undeterred. We were trying to build a treehouse. Fell through the floor. Nail caught us both on the way down. Frank set down his knife and moved to the sink, keeping his back to Richard. Sounds painful. It was. We needed stitches. Parents were furious, but more scared than anything. Richard watched Frank's stiffened posture. Franklin, that was my brother's name. He took all the blame. Said it was his idea, though it was really mine. Frank dried his hands methodically, still not turning around. Brothers protect each other. That's what they do. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Richard couldn't fully decipher. Before he could respond, Jessica burst into the kitchen with news of a last-minute large reservation, and the moment was lost in the ensuing preparations. That night, as Richard closed up the restaurant, he noticed light from the employee locker area. Frank was seated on a bench, his back to the door, shoulders slumped in exhaustion or emotion. Richard couldn't tell which. Intending to offer him a ride home, Richard paused when he saw Frank open a small, tarnished object in his palm. It was a locket, old and worn. Frank gazed at it with such intensity that Richard felt like an intruder witnessing a private moment of grief. As Frank shifted, the locket slipped from his fingers, falling to the floor and skittering toward Richard's feet. Frank didn't notice, his head now bowed, hands covering his face. Richard silently retrieved the fallen locket. It had popped open, revealing a faded photograph of a family, a mother, father, and 2 boys. Richard froze, recognition turning his blood to ice. It was his family, his parents. The same photograph he kept in his wallet, worn thin with handling over decades. Frank finally sensed his presence and turned, his face draining of color when he saw the locket in Richard's hand. "That belongs to me," he said, rising quickly and crossing the room with unexpected swiftness, snatching the locket and pushing past Richard toward the exit. Frank bolted through the kitchen's back door, disappearing into the alley with the locket clutched tightly in his fist. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he'd just seen. That photograph, his family, his parents, the same image he'd carried in his wallet for decades, worn and creased from constant handling. How could Frank possibly have it? Richard burst into the rainy night, scanning the alley, but Frank had vanished. The distant rumble of thunder matched the turbulence in Richard's mind as he slowly returned to the restaurant, rain mingling with unexpected tears on his face. "It can't be," Richard whispered to himself, leaning against the kitchen counter. But who else would have that photograph? Sleep eluded Richard that night. He tossed and turned beside Melissa, his thoughts circling endlessly around the locket, the scar, the familiar gestures and techniques that had nagged at his subconscious from the moment Frank appeared in his life. When dawn finally came, Richard had reached a decision. He would confront Frank directly, demand answers about the locket and the impossible coincidences that could no longer be dismissed. But when he arrived at the restaurant, Frank wasn't there. Jessica looked up from her morning coffee, surprised at Richard's disheveled appearance. "Everything okay?" "Have you seen Frank?" Richard asked, trying to mask his urgency. "Not yet. He's usually here by now, though." She frowned. "Richard, you look terrible. What's going on?" Richard sank into a chair, suddenly uncertain whether to share his suspicions. "I think Frank might be hiding something important." Jessica's expression shifted from concern to wariness. "What kind of something? Are we talking criminal past? Because I warned you about—" "No, nothing like that," Richard interrupted. "It's personal. Just let me know the minute he comes in." The morning dragged by without any sign of Frank. Richard moved through prep work mechanically, his mind elsewhere, until Jessica approached him just before lunch service. "Frank called," she said, watching Richard carefully. "Said he's got a stomach bug. Won't be in today." Richard nodded, unsurprised. Frank was avoiding him, which only reinforced his suspicions. "Did he say anything else?" Just that he'd be back tomorrow. Jessica hesitated. Richard, you need to tell me what's going on. This place is finally turning around. We can't afford disruptions. Richard considered his words carefully. I think Frank might be connected to my past, my family. Connected how? I'm not sure yet, but I intend to find out. The next morning, Richard arrived at Montgomery's an hour earlier than usual, determined to be there when Frank arrived. The restaurant was silent as he unlocked the door, morning light casting long shadows through the dining room. He made coffee and waited, rehearsing questions in his mind. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the back door opened. Frank entered, pausing when he saw Richard sitting alone at the bar. For a moment, it seemed he might turn and leave, but instead, he straightened his shoulders and approached. About yesterday, Frank began, his voice carefully neutral. Where did you get that locket? Richard interrupted, standing to face him. Frank's weathered face revealed nothing. Found it years ago. Reminded me of someone I once knew. It's my family in that photograph. Richard stepped closer. My parents, me, my brother. Lots of families look similar in old photos, Frank countered, but his eyes shifted away. Richard pressed on. The scar on your wrist. It's identical to mine, identical to my brother's. You cook like my mother. You correct techniques exactly like my father did. Coincidences, Frank insisted, moving past Richard toward the kitchen. I don't believe in that many coincidences, Richard said, following him. What are you hiding, Frank? Or should I call you something else? Frank's hands stilled as he reached for his apron. For a long moment he stood motionless, his back to Richard. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. Not these ghosts, Richard insisted. Not when they're standing right in front of me. Please, just tell me the truth. Frank turned slowly, his blue eyes, so familiar, so like Richard's own, filled with an emotion Richard couldn't quite identify. The truth won't bring you peace, Richard. Let me decide that. The conversation was interrupted by Jessica's arrival. Frank immediately busied himself with breakfast preparation, the moment broken. Richard watched him throughout the morning, noting how deliberately Frank avoided being alone with him. The locket was nowhere to be seen. 3 days passed in this strange dance of evasion. Frank remained professionally focused, his work in the kitchen impeccable, but he disappeared during breaks and left promptly at the end of each shift. The restaurant continued its upward trajectory, with more tables filled each night and compliments flowing for the increasingly refined menu. On the 4th day, a Friday evening with every table booked, disaster struck. Their supplier had mixed up deliveries, leaving them short on key ingredients for 3 signature dishes. Richard and Frank worked frantically to adapt, creating alternative preparations with what they had available. In the pressure of the moment, their old tension dissolved. They moved around each other with the synchronicity of longtime partners, communicating in half sentences and nods, anticipating each other's needs without words. When the last order left the kitchen, successfully reimagined despite the shortages, Richard found himself grinning at Frank, the first genuine smile they'd shared since the locket incident. Montgomery family special, Frank muttered, a small smile playing at his lips as he wiped down his station. The phrase hit Richard like a physical blow. It was what their father had called improvised dishes when ingredients ran short in their childhood home. Before Richard could respond, Jessica burst into the kitchen, beaming. Table 12 wants to meet the chefs, she announced. It's William Parker from the Tribune. Richard gathered himself, nodding to Frank. Let's go together. The critic was effusive, praising the harmonious balance and nostalgic yet innovative approach of their emergency creations. As they accepted his compliments, Richard noticed something odd. Frank was unconsciously running his thumb over his scarred wrist, exactly as Franklin had done when nervous as a child. Later that night, as they closed the restaurant, Richard found himself alone with Frank in the kitchen. The evening's success had created a tentative truce between them, and Richard decided to try a different approach. "My brother would be 48 now," he said conversationally, organizing the spice rack. "I lost track of him when I was 8 after our parents died. The system separated us. He was 16, legally still a minor but old enough that nobody wanted to adopt him." Frank remained silent, though his movements slowed as he cleaned the grill. "I searched for years," Richard continued. "Hired investigators, put ads in papers across the country. Nothing." He paused, arranging jars methodically. "Everyone told me to move on, that he was probably dead. But I never believed that. Not really." "Maybe he wanted to be left alone," Frank said quietly, still not looking up. "Maybe he thought you were better off without him." Richard stopped what he was doing, turning to face Frank directly. Nobody would be better off without their family. Frank finally met his gaze, something raw and vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "Some families are better off. Broken, Richard. Some breaks can't be fixed." "I don't believe that," Richard insisted. "Whatever happened to my brother, whatever he's done, wherever he's been, I would still want to know him. I would still want him in my life." Frank shook his head, a weariness settling over his features. "You say that because you imagine a version of him that doesn't exist. The reality would disappoint you." "Try me," Richard challenged softly. The moment hung between them, crackling with unspoken truths. Then Jessica pushed through the door, breaking the spell. "We've got a situation," she said, oblivious to the tension. "The reservation system crashed. We'll have to do everything manually tomorrow." Frank used the interruption to retreat, grabbing his jacket and mumbling something about an early night. Richard watched him go, the frustration of another near breakthrough burning in his chest. The next day brought unexpected news. The bank was reviewing their loan terms. A formal letter arrived, citing changing market conditions and suggesting a meeting to reassess the terms of the agreement. Richard recognized the corporate euphemisms for what they were. The bank was preparing to call in the loan, potentially forcing Montgomery's to close. Richard retreated to his office, the letter crumpled in his fist. His restaurant, his family's legacy, the only tangible connection to his parents, was in jeopardy. And he'd spent the past week distracted by Frank's mysteries instead of focusing on the business. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Frank stood in the doorway, concern evident in his expression. "Jessica mentioned bank troubles," he said, hesitating before entering the small office. Richard nodded, too drained to maintain their standoff. "They're reviewing the loan. Bankers speak for prepare to lose everything." Frank settled into the chair across from him, silent for a long moment. "This restaurant," he finally said, "it means more to you than just a business, doesn't it?" "It's all I have left of them," Richard admitted. "My parents were both chefs. Opening Montgomery's was my way of keeping them alive somehow." He laughed bitterly. "And now I'm about to lose that too." "You won't lose it," Frank said with unexpected firmness. "We'll find a way." Richard looked up, struck by the determination in Frank's voice, the "we" that suggested a commitment beyond employee and employer. "Why do you care so much, Frank?" "Maybe I understand what it means to hold on to the only connection you have left," Frank replied, his eyes drifting to the family photographs on the wall. That evening, Melissa visited the restaurant again, bringing teenage Emma for a rare family dinner at Montgomery's. Richard watched as Frank emerged briefly from the kitchen, his usual reticence melting into something almost grandfatherly as he greeted Emma, presenting her with a special dessert he'd created just for her. "He adores you," Melissa observed later at home as they prepared for bed. "Frank, he can barely look me in the eye most days. That's not indifference, Richard. That's pain." Melissa studied him thoughtfully. "You still think he might be connected to your family somehow?" Richard sighed, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "It's strange, but since he arrived, I've never felt more understood. Not since I lost my parents. It's like he knows what I'm thinking half the time. Have you asked him directly about being related to you somehow? In every way but saying the words, Richard admitted. He deflects, changes the subject, disappears. Melissa sat beside him, taking his hand. Maybe some questions need to be asked plainly, without room for evasion. The next morning, disaster struck. The bank representative called, informing Richard that due to a previously overlooked clause in their loan agreement, they had 30 days to refinance or lose the property. The timeline Richard had thought was months had suddenly contracted to weeks. Richard spent the following nights sleepless, researching refinancing options and alternative lenders, while Frank quietly took on more responsibility in the kitchen. Unbeknownst to Richard, Frank had been subtly improving their signature dishes, attracting the attention of food critics who began to visit with increasing frequency. Tensions reached a breaking point when Melissa's brother suggested selling the restaurant while they could still get a decent price. During a heated discussion in Richard's office, voices carried into the kitchen where Frank was prepping. "This place is all I have left of my family," Richard shouted. "I'm not giving up on it." "Still having that dream of finding your brother someday?" Melissa asked gently, her voice carrying clearly through the partially open door. "Franklin is probably dead," Richard responded bitterly. "If he wasn't, he would have found me by now." In the kitchen, Frank's hands trembled so violently that he knocked several plates from the counter, the crash bringing the argument next door to an abrupt halt. When Richard rushed in, Frank was kneeling amid the broken ceramic, his face ashen. "I'm sorry," Frank mumbled, hands still shaking as he gathered sharp fragments. "Wasn't paying attention." Richard knelt beside him, stilling Frank's trembling hands with his own. "Hey, it's just plates. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank wouldn't meet his eyes. "Just tired. Been pushing too hard lately." Later that night, a violent storm battered the city. Richard, having forgotten important loan documents at the restaurant, drove through the downpour back to Montgomery's. The restaurant was dark, except for a faint light from the storage area at the back. Concerned about a possible break-in, Richard entered cautiously. Following the light source, he pushed open the storage room door to find Frank asleep on an improvised bed of flattened cardboard boxes, an old blanket pulled over him, the locket open in his loosened grip. The family photograph gleamed in the dim light. The realization hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "You're living here," he said aloud. Frank startled awake, instinctively closing the locket and sitting up. "Richard," he managed, clearly disoriented. "What are you doing here?" "Forgot some papers." Richard couldn't look away from the makeshift bed. "How long have you been sleeping here?" Frank rubbed his face, resignation settling over his features. "About 3 months. Lost my room when the building changed owners. Rent's gone crazy in this city." "Why didn't you say something?" Richard demanded, a mix of anger and concern washing over him. "I would have helped you." "I don't need charity," Frank responded sharply, standing with unexpected dignity despite his circumstances. "It's not charity to help family," Richard shot back without thinking. The word hung between them, charged and dangerous. Frank's expression hardened. "We're not family, Richard. I'm your employee. That's it." "Bullshit," Richard exploded, his patience finally snapping. "You have my family's photograph in that locket. You cook like my mother. You correct techniques like my father. You have the same damn scar I do, that my brother did." "Let it go, Richard," Frank warned, his voice low. "Some doors shouldn't be opened." "I've been looking for my brother for 30 years, Richard pressed on, stepping closer. 30 years of dead ends and false hopes. And now here you are, with all these impossibly familiar habits, refusing to answer the simplest questions about your past. "Because my past is none of your business," Frank shouted, his composure finally cracking. "You had your nice, comfortable life while I—" He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. Richard froze. "While you what?" Frank turned away, shoulders rigid with tension. "Look at me," Richard demanded, his voice breaking. "Please." Frank remained facing the wall, his breathing uneven. "If there's even a chance," Richard began. "There isn't," Frank cut him off harshly. "The brother you're looking for doesn't exist anymore. Hasn't for decades. I don't believe you." "Believe what you want," Frank snapped, whirling around, face flushed with anger. "You always were stubborn as a mule, Richie." Richard felt the world stop. Only one person had ever called him that, a nickname from a time before tragedy, before separation, before loss. He stared at Frank, really seeing him for the first time, past the weathered skin and gray hair to the familiar blue eyes, identical to his own. "My God," Richard whispered. "Franklin?" "My God," Richard whispered. "Franklin?" Frank's face crumpled, decades of carefully constructed barriers collapsing in an instant. His shoulders sagged as he leaned heavily against the storage room wall. "You took 5 years to recognize me," he said bitterly, avoiding Richard's stunned gaze. "Not exactly the reunion I imagined." Richard staggered backward, his legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. He groped for support, finding a stack of supply boxes and sinking down onto them. The revelation hit him with physical force, stealing his breath and scrambling his thoughts. His brother, his long-lost brother, had been working in his kitchen for 5 years without saying a word. "How?" Richard finally managed, his voice barely audible over the storm raging outside. "Why didn't you tell me? I searched for you for years, Franklin, years." Franklin, no longer Frank in Richard's mind, gave a humorless laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Did you really? Or did you move on with your perfect life while I was passed from one abusive foster home to another until I ended up on the streets?" The accusation stung like a slap. "That's not fair. I hired detectives. I placed ads in newspapers across the country. I never stopped looking." "Until you did," Franklin countered. "Until you built your restaurant and your family and your respectable life." He gestured vaguely at his own weathered appearance. "Meanwhile, I became this. Would you really have wanted this version of your brother, disrupting your picture-perfect existence?" Richard stood, moving toward Franklin with an outstretched hand, but Franklin recoiled. "Don't," he warned. "Don't pretend this changes anything." "Changes anything? This changes everything," Richard exclaimed. "You're my brother. You're alive. You're coming home with me tonight." Franklin's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "Home? I haven't had a home since I was 16, Richard. I'm not starting now because you suddenly recognized what was right in front of you for 5 years." The rain hammered against the storage room's small window, punctuating the painful silence that followed. Richard struggled to process the impossible truth before him. His older brother, transformed by decades of hardship into a man he hadn't recognized, standing just feet away, yet separated by a gulf of unshared years. "Franklin," Richard began again, softening his voice, "whatever happened in the past, we can what?" Franklin interrupted. "Pretend those 30 years never happened. Pretend I'm not a homeless man you took pity on. Pretend you didn't grow up safe and loved while I—" He stopped, his expression shuddering closed. "Just go home to your wife and daughter, Richard. We'll work together and that's it." Richard shook his head stubbornly. "No, that's not enough, not anymore." The standoff lasted until dawn broke, neither man willing to concede. When Jessica arrived to open the restaurant, she found them in the kitchen, silently prepping for the day as if nothing had changed, though the tension between them crackled like static electricity. Over the following weeks, a painful new dynamic emerged. Franklin reluctantly moved into Richard's guest room, his few possessions fitting into a single duffel bag, but maintained an emotional distance that seemed insurmountable. Decades of distrust had built walls that even blood couldn't easily breach. "He barely speaks," Richard confessed to Melissa late one night, his voice heavy with disappointment. When Emma asks about when we were kids, he changes the subject. It's like having a ghost in the house. Melissa squeezed his hand. He's lived on the streets, Richard. He's survived by keeping people at a distance. That won't change overnight. But he's family, Richard insisted. Emma adores him already. You've been nothing but welcoming. Family is exactly what frightens him, Melissa replied wisely. Because family is what he lost. What you both lost. He's afraid of losing it again. At the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. What had once been Richard's sanctuary now felt like emotional quicksand. The staff sensed the change, exchanging puzzled glances when Richard and Franklin communicated in terse half-sentences, or when one would leave a room as soon as the other entered. Jessica finally cornered Richard in his office after watching Franklin methodically avoid his brother during an entire lunch service. "What's going on between you two?" she demanded. "Last month, you couldn't stop singing his praises. Now you barely look at each other." Richard hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. "It's complicated, Jess." "Complicated how?" "Because whatever it is, it's affecting the restaurant. The kitchen staff has noticed. Even some regular customers have commented on the tension." Richard sighed, the weight of the secret suddenly too heavy to bear alone. "Frank isn't Frank," he admitted. "He's Franklin. My brother." Jessica's jaw dropped. "Your brother? The one you've been searching for all these years?" "The same." "But that's wonderful." Jessica's smile faded as she processed Richard's grim expression. "Isn't it?" "It should be," Richard agreed. "But 30 years is a long time, and his weren't easy. He's angry, Jess. Angry that I had a better life. Angry that I didn't find him sooner." "That's ridiculous," Jessica protested. "You were a child when you were separated." "Logic doesn't always win against emotion," Richard replied, "especially not against 30 years of abandonment issues." That evening, Richard revealed the truth to Melissa in their bedroom, safely out of Franklin's earshot. Her initial shock gave way to compassionate understanding. "No wonder he seemed so familiar from the beginning," she mused. "He has your mannerisms, your focus when you're cooking." "What do I do?" Richard asked, feeling adrift in unfamiliar emotional waters. "How do I reach him?" Melissa considered the question carefully. "Maybe not through words," she suggested. "Food has always been your family's language, hasn't it?" The next morning, Richard found a container in the refrigerator that hadn't been there the night before. Inside was a perfect portion of beef stew, the aroma instantly transporting him to his childhood kitchen. A note in Melissa's handwriting read simply, "Your mother's recipe, as best I could recreate it from your descriptions. For Franklin." Richard placed the container in Franklin's hands before he left for the restaurant. "From Melissa," he explained. "Mom's beef stew, or as close as she could get." Franklin stared at the container, his expression unreadable. "I don't need special treatment." "It's not treatment, it's family," Richard replied. "Just try it." Franklin left the stew untouched that day, but the following morning, Richard noticed the empty container in the sink. 2 days later, another dish appeared. This time, his mother's apple tart. Again, Franklin accepted it with reluctance, but the container returned empty. Slowly, Melissa built a bridge between the brothers through food, sending dishes that evoked their shared childhood. Potato pancakes on Sunday mornings, chicken with rosemary on Wednesdays, pork roast with apples for Sunday dinner. Each meal was a memory, a reminder of what they'd lost and what might still be salvaged. At the restaurant, the bank crisis loomed larger. The 30-day deadline approached with alarming speed, and despite increased business, refinancing seemed impossible with their credit history. Richard spent nights poring over financial statements, searching for a solution that remained elusive. The breaking point came unexpectedly. Franklin disappeared without warning, leaving only a brief note on the kitchen counter. Gone to clear my head. Back for evening shift. Richard tried not to worry, but when Franklin missed the dinner service and didn't return to the house that night, anxiety gnawed at him. One day stretched into 2, then 3. Richard searched the city's shelters, the places where homeless gathered, former haunts Franklin had mentioned in passing. Nothing. His calls went straight to voicemail. It was as if his brother had vanished again, just when Richard had found him. On the morning of the 4th day, a social worker from a downtown shelter returned Richard's call. Yes, a man matching that description was here last night, she confirmed. He seemed to be having some kind of emotional episode. When I asked if there was someone we should contact, he mentioned Montgomery's restaurant before he left. Richard found Franklin sitting alone in a park 2 blocks from the shelter, staring vacantly at a group of children playing. His brother looked smaller somehow, diminished, the carefully maintained dignity stripped away to reveal raw vulnerability. Franklin, Richard said softly, settling beside him on the bench. I had a breakdown, Franklin stated flatly, still watching the children. Happens sometimes. Memories get too loud. Richard waited, sensing that more would come if he remained silent. I always knew who you were, Franklin finally confessed, tears welling in his eyes. Saw your name on the restaurant sign that first day. But how could I, a homeless failure, reveal myself to my successful younger brother? The admission hit Richard like a physical blow. You knew, all this time? Why didn't you say something? Franklin wiped roughly at his eyes. Pride, shame, fear of rejection. Take your pick. He turned to face Richard fully. You had this perfect life, this successful business. I was sleeping under bridges, Richard. How could I possibly insert myself into your world? Because you're my brother, Richard insisted, his own voice breaking. Because I would have given anything, everything, to find you again. Franklin shook his head sadly. The brother you wanted to find doesn't exist anymore. Hasn't for decades. That innocent 16-year-old boy died in his 3rd foster home when he realized no one was coming to save him. As Richard absorbed the devastating truth, he finally understood. While he had been searching for an idealized version of his brother, the protective teenager from his childhood memories, he had failed to see the real, suffering man right in front of him these past 5 years. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you, Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. But I see you now, Franklin. I see you. Richard sat across from Franklin on the park bench, the weight of his brother's revelation settling heavily between them. The man he had spent 30 years searching for had been right in front of him for 5 years, carrying the burden of an identity he felt too ashamed to claim. Come back to the restaurant, Richard said finally, his voice gentle but firm. Come back home. Franklin looked away, watching the children play, their carefree laughter a stark contrast to the pain etched in his weathered face. Is it really that simple for you? Nothing about this is simple, Richard admitted, but we can figure it out together. The walk back to Montgomery's passed in silence, each brother lost in his thoughts. When they arrived, Jessica's relief at seeing Franklin quickly gave way to concern as she noted his haggard appearance. Everything okay? She asked, glancing between the brothers. It will be, Richard answered for both of them. He'd explained Franklin's identity to her earlier, but the full complexities of their situation remained private. That evening, Richard arrived early at the restaurant, hoping to find Franklin at work as promised. The kitchen was empty, and a familiar dread began to creep through him. Had his brother disappeared again? He pushed through the doors to the storage area, bracing himself for another absence. Instead, he found Franklin meticulously organizing supplies, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to reveal the scar that had first triggered Richard's suspicions. You're here, Richard said, unable to hide his relief. Franklin nodded without turning. Said I would be. After you left without a word for 3 days. Forgive me for doubting. Franklin's hand stilled on a jar of dried herbs. I needed time to think. And what did you decide? Richard asked, holding his breath. That I'm too old to keep running. Franklin finally faced him. But this, it won't be fixed overnight. Too many years, too much water under the bridge. The next morning, Richard woke up to find Emma already dressed for school, hovering near the guest room where Franklin slept. At 16, his daughter had inherited her mother's practical nature, but possessed a romantic streak that manifested in her fascination with the uncle she'd just discovered. He's still sleeping, Richard whispered, gently steering her toward the kitchen. Let him rest. I've made a photo album, Emma announced over breakfast, sliding a leather-bound book across the table. Old family pictures I found in the attic. I thought Uncle Franklin might like to see them. Richard leafed through the carefully assembled pages. Photographs of their parents, of family holidays, of 2 young brothers with identical blue eyes and mischievous smiles. Where did you find all these? In those boxes you never unpacked after we moved, Emma replied, sounding proud of her detective work. There were letters, too, ones you wrote trying to find him. Richard's throat tightened. This is good, honey. But be patient with him, okay? He's not used to family. When Franklin finally emerged, dressed in clothes Richard had lent him, slightly too short in the sleeves, but cleaner and newer than anything he'd worn in years, Emma immediately presented him with the album. Franklin accepted it with visible trepidation, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the cover. I'll leave you to it, Richard said, recognizing Franklin's need for privacy as he confronted these ghosts from their shared past. Later that day, Jessica approached Richard at the restaurant with the day's mail. The bank sent another letter, she said, her expression grim. Richard opened it, scanning the contents with growing dismay. Despite the uptick in business, the bank remained unmoved. 20 days until they called in the loan. The pressure of potential failure weighed on him as he pushed through the afternoon prep. Something's wrong, Franklin observed, as they worked side by side, the brothers falling into an efficient rhythm despite the tension between them. Richard hesitated before sharing the truth. The bank's not budging. We have less than 3 weeks to come up with a refinancing plan. Franklin absorbed this silently, his knife never faltering as he continued to chop. This place means a lot to you, he said finally. It wasn't a question. It's not just a restaurant, Richard admitted. It's what Mom and Dad would have wanted. It's legacy. That evening, a food critic from a prominent online publication dined anonymously at Montgomery's. Richard only realized when Jessica slipped him a note during service. The kitchen's response was flawless, with Franklin subtly elevating each dish that crossed his station. The brothers communicated in the shorthand of experienced cooks, anticipating each other's needs without words. After closing, Richard found Franklin sitting alone at the bar, staring at the photo album Emma had created. She's a good kid, Franklin said without looking up. Smart like her mother. Has your eyes, though. She's named after Mom, Richard said, settling on the stool beside him. Emma Montgomery Richards. Melissa thought it was important to keep the family name alive. Franklin's finger traced a photograph of their mother, her arms wrapped around 2 small boys on a beach somewhere. I tried to forget all of this, he confessed. Spent years pretending I never had a family. It was easier than remembering what I'd lost. And now? Richard asked. Franklin closed the album gently. Now I don't know what's worse, remembering or realizing how much I've missed. The following days established a fragile new routine. Franklin remained at Richard's house, though he spent most of his time at the restaurant, arriving early and staying late. He avoided family dinners, claiming kitchen prep required his attention, but Richard occasionally caught him in quiet conversation with Emma, patiently answering her questions about cooking techniques. He taught me how to make Grandma's apple dumplings yesterday, Emma announced one evening as she helped set the table. He remembers exactly how she folded the dough. Richard smiled, though a pang of jealousy surprised him. He was 8 years older than me. His memories are clearer. Melissa touched his arm, reading his expression. "It's good that he's connecting with her," she said softly. "It gives him a safe way back into the family." Meanwhile, the bank situation grew more desperate. Richard approached several potential investors, but none were willing to take a chance on a restaurant with Montgomery's financial history, despite its recent improvements. The deadline loomed closer with each passing day. One evening, Richard returned to the restaurant long after closing to collect financial documents for yet another loan application. He expected to find the place dark and empty, but instead discovered Franklin in the kitchen, surrounded by open cookbooks and scribbled notes. "What's all this?" Richard asked, surveying the organized chaos. Franklin looked up, momentarily startled. "Research. Ideas for menu refinements that might attract more high-end clientele." Richard leafed through the notes, recognizing adaptations of their mother's recipes alongside modern techniques. "You're trying to save the restaurant." "Someone has to," Franklin replied, a hint of the old bitterness creeping into his voice. "While you've been distracted looking for financing, our food quality has become inconsistent." "Distracted?" Richard echoed, incredulous. "I've been trying to save 30 years of work." "And neglecting what made this place special in the first place," Franklin countered. "The food, Richard. It's always been about the food." The argument escalated, old wounds reopening as the brothers finally voiced the resentments that had simmered since Franklin's revelation. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this restaurant," Richard shouted. "And you have no idea what I sacrificed just to survive," Franklin fired back. "While you were building this place, I was fighting for my next meal." The painful truth of Franklin's words hung in the air between them. Richard's anger deflated, replaced by a hollow understanding. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I don't know what you went through. I never can. But I do know what this place means to me, to us. It's the last connection to who we were before everything fell apart." Franklin's expression softened slightly. "I know," he said. "Why do you think I'm still here?" The next morning, Emma surprised both men by arriving at the restaurant after school with a large poster board under her arm. Without explanation, she began pinning photographs to it. Pictures of customers celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, engagements at Montgomery's over the years. "What's this?" Richard asked, watching her work. "History," Emma replied simply. "I've been asking your regular customers to share photos of their special moments here. This restaurant isn't just your legacy, Dad. It's part of their stories, too." Franklin studied the growing collage of memories, his expression thoughtful. "Smart kid," he murmured, before disappearing into the kitchen. That afternoon, while Richard met with yet another potential investor, Melissa embarked on her own mission. Armed with recent photographs of Franklin, she methodically visited homeless shelters across the city. At the third location, a social worker recognized him immediately. "Frank? Sure, he used to come here regularly. Quiet guy, kept to himself, but always helped in the kitchen when we were short-handed." "Did he ever talk about his past?" Melissa asked. "About his family?" The woman hesitated. "Not much. Once mentioned a brother he'd lost touch with. Said it was his biggest regret." Melissa returned home with this knowledge, holding it close as a gift she might offer Richard when the moment was right. Meanwhile, Richard's financial meeting ended in another rejection. Driving home, the weight of impending failure pressed down on him. 30 years of searching for his brother, only to find him in time to lose the restaurant that had become his life's work. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. As Richard pulled into his driveway, his phone rang, Emma's excited voice bubbling through the speaker. Dad, I found someone who knows Uncle Franklin. A homeless man at St. Mary's shelter recognized his picture, He says they used to attend the same soup kitchen. Richard's heart raced as he processed this information. Where is this man now? That's why I'm calling, Emma replied. He's at the restaurant. He came looking for Uncle Franklin to thank him for something. Something about Monday meals. Richard rushed back to Montgomery's, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed falling into place. In the kitchen, he found Franklin speaking quietly with an elderly homeless man. Raymond, Franklin was saying, you shouldn't have come here. Had to thank you, the old man insisted. Those Monday meals kept me going. When you stopped showing up, I got worried. Richard stepped forward. Monday meals? Franklin looked up, discomfort evident in his expression. It's nothing. It ain't nothing, Raymond contradicted. Every Monday when this place is closed for years now, Frank here, or Franklin, I guess, would cook up meals for folks at the shelter. Used leftover supplies that would have gone to waste otherwise. Never took credit, never wanted thanks. Richard stared at his brother, seeing him truly for the first time. While Richard had been searching for an idealized memory, the real Franklin had been here all along, using the skills their parents had taught them to help others in need, even when he had so little himself. During the tumultuousness of service that evening, Richard noticed Franklin had disappeared. A quick search of the kitchen revealed nothing, and a knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. A staff member approached, noticing his concern. If you're looking for Franklin, he stepped out the back door about 20 minutes ago after getting a phone call. Seemed pretty upset. Richard rushed through the kitchen and out the back door, heart hammering in his chest. The alley was empty except for the usual dumpsters and stacked delivery crates. No sign of Franklin. That familiar dread, the one he'd carried for 30 years whenever he thought about his lost brother, washed over him again. Just when they'd started to reconnect, had Franklin disappeared once more? Behind him, the kitchen door swung open. He went that way, said Luis, one of the line cooks, pointing toward the street. Looked pretty shaken up. Richard nodded his thanks and jogged to the end of the alley. The evening crowd filled the sidewalks, but there was no sign of his brother among them. He pulled out his phone, calling Franklin's number for the third time. Straight to D. Voicemail again. After an hour of searching nearby streets and Franklin's old haunts, Richard returned to the restaurant, defeated. The dinner service was in full swing, the kitchen managing without either of them, though barely. Jessica gave him a questioning look as he passed through to his office. Still no sign of him, Richard admitted, slumping into his chair. Something's wrong, Jess. That phone call upset him. Jessica's expression softened. Go home, Richard. If he's coming back, that's where he'll go. The house was quiet when Richard arrived, Melissa already asleep after her long day. He checked the guest room. Franklin's few possessions remained untouched, his bed still made with hospital corners, a habit from his brief military stint decades ago. At least he hadn't packed and run. Richard settled on the living room couch, determined to wait up. Exhaustion eventually overcame him, and he drifted into uneasy sleep. The sound of the front door opening jolted him awake. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Franklin stood in the doorway, his silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. He didn't seem surprised to find Richard waiting for him. Where have you been? Richard asked, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Melissa and Emma. Franklin moved to the kitchen without answering, switching on only the small light above the sink. Richard followed, watching as his brother filled a glass with water and drank it in one long swallow. That call at the restaurant, Franklin finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Robert Sullivan died tonight. Richard's brow furrowed. Sullivan. My third foster father, Franklin clarified, his knuckles white around the empty glass. The worst of them. Understanding dawned on Richard's face. The man Franklin had mentioned during his breakdown, the abusive foster parent who had broken something fundamental in the teenage brother Richard remembered. "Is that good news or bad news?" Richard asked carefully. Franklin set the glass down, with deliberate control. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent 30 years hating that man. Now he's gone, and I don't feel anything at all." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Richard waited, sensing Franklin had more to say. "The hospital called me because I'm still listed as his emergency contact," Franklin continued, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Ironic, isn't it? The kid he beat regularly is the only person they could find to notify." "Franklin," Richard began, reaching across the counter. Franklin pulled back slightly. "Don't. I'm not ready for that." He gestured vaguely between them. "I just need some sleep." As Franklin turned to leave, Richard called after him. "We missed you tonight at the restaurant." Franklin paused in the doorway, his back to Richard. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said simply, then disappeared down the hallway. The next morning, Emma was already seated at the kitchen table when Richard came downstairs. She looked up from her phone with concern etched across her young face. "Is Uncle Franklin okay?" she asked. "I heard him come in really late." Richard considered how much to share with his daughter. He received some difficult news about someone from his past, he explained. He needed some time alone. Emma nodded solemnly. "I made him something," she said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside was a carefully annotated copy of an old Montgomery family recipe for cinnamon rolls, their mother's specialty for Sunday mornings. "I found it in Grandma's recipe box in the attic," Emma explained. "I thought maybe we could make them together this weekend. The three of us." Richard's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "That's thoughtful, honey, really thoughtful." Emma smiled tentatively. "He likes cooking with me. He doesn't get all weird and quiet like he does with you and Mom." Richard couldn't help but laugh at his daughter's blunt assessment. "We've got 30 years of complications. Between us, you're simpler." "Maybe that's what he needs," Emma observed with surprising wisdom. "Someone who just sees him as Uncle Franklin, not as whatever he was before." Franklin appeared in the doorway, dressed in the clothes Richard had lent him, looking exhausted but composed. His eyes fell on the open recipe folder. "Mom's cinnamon rolls," he noted, recognition flashing across his face. "Haven't thought about those in years." Emma brightened. "I want to learn how to make them. Dad says you probably remember the technique better than he does." Franklin glanced at Richard, something unreadable passing between them. "Your father was too young to help much with these. Always ended up with more flour on his face than in the bowl." It was the first voluntary childhood memory Franklin had shared, and Richard felt a small victory in the casual revelation. "Sunday morning," Emma pressed. "We could make them before the restaurant opens." Franklin hesitated, then nodded once. "Sunday," he agreed. At the restaurant that day, Franklin worked with focused intensity, speaking only when necessary, his movements precise and efficient. The staff, sensing his mood, gave him space. Richard found himself watching his brother from across the kitchen, noting how Franklin had become an essential part of Montgomery's operations, without anyone fully realizing it. Jessica approached during the afternoon lull, coffee in hand. "Everything okay with our prodigal brother?" she asked quietly. "Getting there," Richard replied, slowly. "Well, whatever's going on with him personally, his cooking hasn't suffered," Jessica noted. "That critic's review posted online this morning. 4.5 stars, specifically mentioning the soul-satisfying depth of our sauces." Richard smiled. "That's all Franklin. He's been tweaking every recipe since he arrived." 5 years ago, Jessica reminded him. "Hard to believe he's been your brother all along." "Hard to believe I didn't see it," Richard D. admitted. Jessica shrugged. "People see what they expect to see. You expected a homeless man needing work, not your long-lost brother." That evening, as Richard prepared to close up, A nurse appeared at the restaurant's front door. Though they were technically closed, Richard let her in. "I'm looking for Franklin Montgomery," she said. "The hospital said I might find him here." Richard called Franklin from the kitchen, watching his brother's face carefully as he approached the nurse. "Mr. Sullivan's personal effects," she explained, handing over a small plastic bag. "There's not much, I'm afraid, but you were listed as his next of kin." Franklin accepted the bag with a stiff nod. "Thank you for bringing this." After she left, Franklin stood motionless in the empty restaurant, the bag dangling from his fingers. Richard moved closer, uncertain whether to offer comfort or space. "Do you want to be alone?" he asked. Franklin seemed to consider the question carefully. "No," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Not this time." They sat at the bar, and Franklin emptied the bag between them. A worn wallet, a hospital ID bracelet, a cheap watch with a cracked face, and a faded photograph of a young boy holding a fishing rod. "That's you," Richard realized, pointing to the photo. Franklin nodded. "The only good day I had with him. Took me fishing once when he was sober. Caught 3 trout. He touched the photo's edge gently. He was capable of kindness. That almost made it worse. Richard listened as Franklin slowly, haltingly began to share fragments of his past. The violent foster homes, the streets, the odd jobs, the brief stretches of stability always followed by collapse. It was the first time Franklin had voluntarily opened up about the years they'd spent apart. "There were good people too," Franklin admitted. "A diner owner in Chicago who taught me how to make the perfect hash browns. A chef in New Orleans who let me sleep in his restaurant storage room in exchange for prep work." He paused. "But nothing lasted. I didn't know how to let it last." As dawn approached, Franklin finally fell silent, the story of his nomadic existence hanging heavy between them. Richard understood now why his brother had been so reluctant to claim his identity. His life had been defined by impermanence and survival, not the accomplishments and stability Richard had achieved. "How did you survive it?" Richard asked softly. "All those years?" Franklin considered the question. "Cooking," he answered simply. "Wherever I went, whatever happened, I could always cook. It was the one thing that connected me to them." He didn't need to specify that he meant their parents. Sunday morning arrived with pale winter sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. Richard came downstairs to find Emma and Franklin already at work, flour dusting the countertops, the familiar scent of their mother's cinnamon rolls filling the house. "He remembers exactly how Grandma folded the dough," Emma told Richard excitedly. "And the secret is warming the milk to exactly the right temperature." Franklin glanced up, a smudge of flour on his cheek, making him look younger somehow. "She's a natural," he said, nodding toward Emma. "Gets the touch from your side of the family." Richard watched them work together, his brother and his daughter, bridging generations that had almost remained disconnected forever. Emma chattered easily, asking questions about cooking techniques and family stories, while Franklin answered with increasing comfort, his usual guardedness softening in her presence. "You're good with her," Richard observed later as they walked to the restaurant together, leaving Melissa and Emma to enjoy the freshly baked rolls. Franklin shrugged. "She makes it easy. No expectations, no history." "Unlike with me," Richard acknowledged. "She just wants to know her uncle," Franklin said. "You want the brother you lost 30 years ago. That person doesn't exist anymore, Richard." Richard stopped walking, turning to face his brother directly. "I'm starting to understand that," he said honestly, "and I'm finding I want to know the person you are now just as much." Franklin's expression betrayed surprise before he quickly schooled his features. "We should get to the restaurant," he said, deflecting as always, but Richard noticed he walked a little closer as they continued down the street. At the restaurant, they found Melissa waiting for them, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I've been talking to some of the staff," she said without preamble, "about Franklin's Monday meals for the homeless." Franklin shot a sharp look at Richard, who raised his hands defensively. "I didn't tell her." "Raymond did," Melissa explained. "He came back looking for you yesterday. Told me everything about how you've been cooking meals for the shelter every Monday for years." Her eyes were warm with admiration. Using Montgomery's kitchen to feed people who needed it most. Franklin shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. It was just leftovers that would have gone to waste. "It was kindness," Melissa corrected gently. "The same kindness that's in every dish you cook here." She smiled. "The same kindness that's in your cinnamon rolls, which, by the way, made Emma cry because they tasted exactly like the ones Richard has described her grandmother making." Franklin looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. The acknowledgement of his secret charity seemed to embarrass him more than anything else. "It was nothing," he muttered, busying himself with checking the prep list for the day. "It wasn't nothing to the people you fed," Melissa persisted gently. "Raymond said sometimes it was the only decent meal they'd get all week." Richard watched this exchange with newfound understanding. His brother, the man he'd spent decades imagining as lost or dead, had been quietly serving others even when he had nothing himself. The realization humbled him profoundly. "We should get to work," Franklin said, effectively ending the conversation. "Sunday brunch service starts in an hour." As Franklin disappeared into the walk-in refrigerator, Melissa turned to Richard. "He's still running," she observed quietly. "Just in a different way now." The restaurant was unusually busy that Sunday, perhaps bolstered by the recent positive review. Richard and Franklin moved around each other in the kitchen with growing synchronicity, their shared instincts creating a dance that felt both new and familiar. When Richard reached for herbs, Franklin had already set them nearby. When Franklin needed more prepped vegetables, Richard had anticipated the need minutes before. Jessica noticed their improved dynamic immediately. "Whatever happened between you two," she whispered to Richard during a brief lull, "keep it up. The kitchen hasn't run this smoothly in years." As the last brunch customers lingered over coffee, Franklin was methodically preparing components for the dinner service. Richard approached, observing his brother's precise knife work, a technique their father had insisted upon, the blade rolling forward in a continuous motion, rather than chopping up and down. "Dad would be impressed," Richard commented. "You still cut vegetables exactly the way he taught us." Franklin's hands stilled momentarily. "Some lessons stick," he said, resuming his work without looking up. "What other lessons do you remember?" Richard asked, testing these fragile waters of shared memory. Franklin considered the question, his knife never pausing. Mom's rule about tasting everything 3 times. Dad's insistence on cleaning as you go. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The way they'd dance in the kitchen when they thought we weren't watching. The memory struck Richard like a physical force. His parents swaying to the radio, flour-covered hands leaving prints on each other's clothes. He'd almost forgotten that detail. "They were happy together," Richard said softly. "Even when money was tight." "Even when I was causing trouble," Franklin added, his tone lighter than Richard had ever heard it. This unexpected opening encouraged Richard. "You were always testing boundaries. Remember when you convinced me we could make pancakes without waking them up?" "We set off the smoke alarm," Franklin recalled, actually chuckling. "Dad came running in wearing nothing but boxers, fire extinguisher in hand. Mom was right behind him with a baseball bat," Richard added, laughing. For a moment they were just brothers again, sharing memories without the weight of 3 decades of separation. Then Franklin's expression clouded, and he returned his attention to the vegetables before him. "That was a different life," he said quietly. The next morning, Richard arrived at the restaurant to find Franklin already there, reviewing the books Jessica had left out. His brother looked up with concern etched across his weathered face. "These numbers aren't sustainable," Franklin said without preamble. "Even with increased business, we're barely keeping pace with the interest on the loan." Richard sighed, dropping into the chair opposite. "I know. The bank won't budge on the refinancing terms either. 20 days left until they call the loan due." Franklin closed the ledger, his expression serious. "Richard, have you considered that you might need to sell?" "Not you too," Richard groaned. "Melissa's brother has been pushing that angle since this started." "It's not what I want," Franklin clarified. "But we need to be realistic about our options." "This restaurant is all I have left of our family," Richard insisted, frustration bleeding into his voice. "I'm not giving it up without a fight." Franklin studied him for a long moment. "You have a wife, a daughter, and now, apparently, a brother. The restaurant isn't all you have." Richard was stunned by this rare moment of emotional directness from Franklin. Before he could respond, Jessica arrived with the morning's mail, including another letter from the bank. "More bad news?" Richard asked, noting her grim expression. "They're sending a representative for a final evaluation next week," Jessica confirmed. "After that, they'll make their decision on calling the loan." The pressure of this deadline hung over Montgomery's like a storm cloud. While Richard pursued increasingly desperate refinancing options, Franklin immersed himself in the kitchen, quietly refining recipes and training the staff to higher standards. Critical acclaim continued to build, with food bloggers and local reviewers praising the restaurant's renaissance, but financial salvation remained elusive. 3 nights later, Richard discovered Franklin alone in the kitchen long after closing, testing variations of a sauce their mother had been famous for in their childhood. "You should be resting," Richard admonished, though without heat. "We've had back-to-back packed services." Franklin didn't look up from his work. "Needed to get this right," he replied, carefully adjusting the heat under a simmering pot. "Mom's sauce had a distinct flavor I couldn't quite recreate. Finally figured out she used star anise, just a hint of it." Richard leaned against the counter, watching his brother work with the focused intensity that had become familiar over these past weeks. "You really do remember her cooking better than I do." "I was older," Franklin said simply, then added with unexpected gentleness, "and you were only 8 when we lost them. No child should have to remember so much at that age." The statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of their shared trauma, wrapped in something like forgiveness. Richard felt a tightness in his chest dissolve slightly. "I never stopped looking, you know," he said quietly. "Even when everyone told me to give up, that you were probably dead," Franklin finished for him, finally meeting his gaze. "I know. Emma showed me the letters, the private investigator reports. I just couldn't understand why you'd go to such lengths." "Because you were my brother," Richard said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Because whenever I succeeded at anything, my first thought was always, I wish Franklin could see this." Franklin turned back to his sauce, but not before Richard caught the moisture gathering in his eyes. After a moment, Franklin spoke again, his voice rougher than before. "Your daughter reminds me of Mom. Same determination, same creativity with food." Richard smiled. "She's been cooking since she could reach the counter. Gets flour everywhere, just like I used to." "She's got real talent," Franklin observed. "Better instincts than either of us had at her age." Their conversation continued as Franklin completed his sauce, memories flowing more easily between them than ever before. When they finally left the restaurant in the early morning hours, something fundamental had shifted between the brothers, a bridge slowly being rebuilt over the chasm of lost years. The following days brought new challenges as the bank's deadline approached. Montgomery saw an uptick in business thanks to Franklin's culinary refinements, but it wasn't enough to solve their financial crisis. Richard spent hours on the phone with potential investors, while Franklin threw himself into perfecting the menu, as if the quality of their food alone could save them. One evening, Melissa attended a dinner service, sitting at the small table in the kitchen that Richard reserved for family. As she watched the brothers work together, she leaned toward Jessica. "They're finally starting to look like family again," she observed. "The way they move around each other, you'd think they'd been cooking together their whole lives." Jessica nodded. "It's been good for the restaurant. The staff has noticed it too. The atmosphere in the kitchen has completely changed." Later that night, as they closed up, a local farmer who supplied Montgomery's with produce stopped by with an unusual delivery. "Found these old seed catalogs I thought might interest you," he told Richard, handing over a stack of weathered publications. "They've got articles about heirloom vegetables your parents used to grow. Thought you might want to continue the tradition." Richard stared at the man in surprise. "My parents? You knew them?" The farmer nodded. "Your father was particular about his vegetables. Used to drive out to the farm personally to select them. Your mother had a gift for knowing exactly when tomatoes were at their peak." He glanced between Richard and Franklin. "Good to see both Montgomery boys carrying on their legacy. Your folks would be proud." After he left, Richard found Franklin staring at the seed catalogs, a distant expression on his face. "Dad used to take me with him sometimes," Franklin said softly, "to choose produce. He taught me how to thump a watermelon to check if it was ripe." Richard smiled. "Mom showed me how to smell a peach to test its ripeness. Said you could tell more from the scent than the color." Franklin nodded, carefully opening one of the catalogs. She was right. Always was about food. That Sunday, while the restaurant was closed, Richard found Franklin and Emma huddled over the old family recipe box in the kitchen at home. They were sorting through yellowed index cards covered in his mother's elegant handwriting. "Uncle Franklin says we should bring back Grandma's special Sunday roast," Emma announced as Richard joined them. "The one with the rosemary crust." "We'd need to adapt it," Franklin added, studying the recipe card. "Modern palates expect more complexity." "But keep the essence," Emma insisted. "That's what makes it special. It tells our family story." During the tumultuousness of service that evening, Richard noticed how Franklin had taken to quietly correcting Emma's technique when she helped in the kitchen, the same way their father had taught them. There was a gentleness in these corrections that Richard had rarely seen from his brother, a patience that spoke of deeper healing taking place. "You're good with her," Richard commented later, as they prepared for the bank's final inspection the following day. Franklin shrugged. "She listens, wants to learn." "She adores you," Richard said. "We all do." Franklin paused in his work, clearly uncomfortable with the sentiment. "Don't get attached," he warned. "If this place goes under, I'll move on. That's what I do." "Is that what you want?" Richard challenged. "To keep running?" Franklin didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I don't know how to stay rich. I never learned how." "I don't know how to stay rich. I never learned how." The words hung in the air between them, Franklin's admission laying bare 3 decades of nomadic existence. Richard wanted to respond, to reassure his brother that he could learn, that they could figure it out together. But his phone interrupted the moment. The screen displayed an unknown number. "Montgomery," he answered, turning slightly away from Franklin. "Richard Montgomery, this is Nurse Kelly from St. Luke's Hospital. We have you listed as an emergency contact for a patient who was just admitted." Richard's brow furrowed. There must be some mistake. "Who's the patient?" "Robert Sullivan." The name struck Richard like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Robert Sullivan died days ago." "Sir, I'm looking at his chart right now. Robert Sullivan, 72, was admitted an hour ago following a stroke. He's in critical condition." Richard glanced at Franklin, who was watching him with growing concern. "My brother was notified of his death earlier this week." "I see the confusion," the nurse replied after checking her records. "This Robert Sullivan was initially treated at County General and erroneously declared deceased after a cardiac episode. When he stabilized, he was transferred to our facility. We're still investigating the miscommunication. After hanging up, Richard turned to Franklin, unsure how to deliver this news. That was St. Luke's Hospital. Robert Sullivan is alive. Franklin's face drained of color. That's not possible. They gave me his belongings. There was a mistake between hospitals. He had a stroke and was admitted to St. Luke's tonight. He's in critical condition. Franklin's hand, so steady with a knife, trembled visibly as he gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter. He's supposed to be dead, he whispered. Franklin, I can't deal with this now. Franklin turned away, grabbing his jacket. We have service to prepare for. But as the evening progressed, Richard noticed Franklin's uncharacteristic distraction. A sauce left to reduce too long, a plate returned for being undercooked. The news had shaken his brother deeply, disturbing the careful balance he'd maintained. When service ended, Richard found Franklin sitting alone in the darkened dining room, staring at nothing. We should talk about Sullivan, Richard ventured. Nothing to talk about. Clearly there is. You've been off all night. Franklin ran a hand over his face. What do you want me to say? That I'm disappointed the man who made my adolescence hell is still breathing? I want you to say whatever you're feeling, Richard replied, pulling up a chair. You've carried this alone for too long. For a moment, Richard thought Franklin would shut down again, retreat behind the walls he'd built over decades. Instead, his brother exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. When they told me he was dead, I felt nothing. Not relief, not closure, nothing. Franklin's voice was barely audible. Now he's alive again, and I feel everything. Rage, fear, like I'm 16 again, helpless in his house. Richard listened, fighting the urge to fill the silence with reassurances. Franklin rarely opened up, and he knew interrupting might cause him to withdraw. I tried to find you, Franklin continued, the words spilling out now. After the first foster home failed, I called the agency, begged them to tell me where you were. They refused, said it would disrupt your adjustment to contact you. Richard felt his chest tighten. All those years, both brothers searching, both thwarted by a system meant to protect them. By the time I landed with the Sullivans, I was already labeled a problem case, running away, fighting. Franklin's gaze remained fixed on the empty space before him. Robert Sullivan was a respected community member, a deacon at his church. Nobody believed me when I reported the abuse. They said I was manipulative, attention-seeking. I'm so sorry, Richard whispered. When I aged out of the system, I tried again to find you. Discovered you'd been adopted by distant relatives, given opportunities I never had. I told myself you were better off without me dragging you down. The revelation stunned Richard. You knew where I was all this time? Franklin nodded slowly. Not always. I'd find you, lose track for years, find you again. Saw the announcement when you opened this place. A bitter smile crossed his face. Stood across the street during your grand opening. Couldn't bring myself to come in. Why now? Richard asked. After all those years, why apply for a job here 5 years ago? I was dying, Franklin stated flatly. Homeless, sick, nowhere to go. Thought I'd see you one last time before... He shrugged. Then you offered me a job and I got better. Never meant to stay this long. The image of his brother, ill and alone, preparing to die without reaching out, hit Richard like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Franklin stood abruptly. I need to see him, he announced. Sullivan? Now? Before I lose my nerve. Franklin's expression hardened. Need to look him in the face one last time. Richard grabbed his keys. I'm coming with you. The hospital corridors were quiet at this late hour, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Franklin walked with rigid determination, his jaw set. When they reached Sullivan's room, he hesitated, hand on the door. "You don't have to do this," Richard said quietly. "Yes, I do." The room was dimly lit, machines beeping softly. Robert Sullivan lay still, looking smaller and more fragile than the monster of Franklin's descriptions. Franklin approached the bed slowly, studying the unconscious man's face. "He looks harmless now," Franklin observed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Hard to believe those hands could inflict so much damage." Richard remained by the door, witnessing his brother's confrontation with the architect of so much of his suffering. Franklin stood over Sullivan for a long time, silent and watchful. "What are you thinking?" Richard finally asked. "That I wasted decades letting this man haunt me," Franklin replied. "That he gets to die in a clean hospital bed with medical care, while kids like I was suffer in silence behind closed doors." A nurse appeared at the doorway. "Are you family?" "No," Franklin answered immediately. "Yes," Richard contradicted. "He's listed as Mr. Sullivan's emergency contact." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "The doctor can provide an update on his condition if you'd like." "He'll die soon?" Franklin asked bluntly. "His prognosis is poor," she confirmed. "The stroke caused significant brain damage. It's unlikely he'll regain consciousness." After she left, Franklin continued his silent vigil. "I used to dream about killing him," he confessed. "Used to imagine confronting him, making him suffer like he made me suffer." He paused. "Now I just feel pity." "That makes you the better man," Richard said. Franklin shook his head. "It makes me tired. Tired of carrying him with me everywhere I go." They remained until dawn, Franklin watching his former tormentor, Richard watching his brother. As the first light filtered through the hospital windows, Franklin finally turned away from the bed. "I'm done," he stated simply. "Let's go home." Outside, as they walked to the car, Franklin stopped suddenly. "I need you to know something. Everything I told you about the foster homes, the abuse, it's all true. But I left out the worst parts." "You don't need to." "I do," Franklin insisted. "I need you to understand why I am the way I am." He took a deep breath. "The things Sullivan did, they broke something in me. Something I've never been able to fix. Made me believe I didn't deserve anything good, anything permanent. That's why I kept running, why I never reached out even when I found you." Richard felt tears gathering in his eyes. "You didn't deserve any of it. I know that here," Franklin tapped his temple, "but not here." He placed his hand over his heart. "Not where it counts." When they returned to Richard's house, they found Melissa in the kitchen, concern evident on her face as she prepared breakfast. "You've been out all night," she observed, setting down her spatula. "Emma was worried when no one was here this morning." Richard briefly explained their hospital visit while Franklin slumped into a chair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Are you okay?" Melissa asked Franklin directly. Franklin considered the question with unusual seriousness. "No," he admitted. "But maybe I'm closer than I was yesterday." Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas. "Uncle Franklin?" she asked tentatively. "Are you sick?" The genuine concern in her voice seemed to touch something in Franklin. "Just tired, kid. Long night." Emma approached, studying him with a frank assessment of youth. "You look sad." "Emma," Melissa warned gently. "It's okay," Franklin assured her, meeting his niece's gaze. "I am sad. About things that happened a long time ago." Emma nodded solemnly. "Dad says when he's sad about the past, cooking helps him remember the good parts instead." A ghost of a smile touched Franklin's lips. "Your dad's pretty smart sometimes." "Does that mean you're staying?" Emma asked, hope evident in her voice. "Even if the restaurant closes?" Franklin glanced at Richard, then back to his niece. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, kid. That's the honest truth." The days following the hospital visit brought no respite from the mounting pressure of Montgomery's financial situation. Richard spent every waking moment poring over spreadsheets and loan applications, his dining room table disappearing beneath stacks of paperwork. The bank's deadline loomed ever closer. Just 14 days remained until they would potentially lose everything. "Any progress?" Franklin asked one morning, finding Richard already at the table despite the early hour. Richard shook his head wearily. 3 more rejections yesterday. Nobody wants to refinance a restaurant with our debt-to-income ratio, no matter how good the reviews have been lately. Franklin poured himself coffee and sat across from his brother. The hospital had called the previous evening to inform them that Robert Sullivan had passed away, but neither brother had mentioned it since. Some ghosts, it seemed, were finally being laid to rest. "Craig called again," Richard continued, referring to Melissa's brother. "He says his investor friend is still interested in buying the property." "The franchise guy?" Franklin clarified, his expression darkening. "The one who wants to gut the place and turn it into another soulless chain restaurant." Richard nodded grimly. "He's increased his offer. Says it's his final and best." A tense silence settled between them as the reality of their situation sank in. Despite all their efforts, Franklin's culinary improvements, Richard's financial maneuvering, the staff's dedication, they might still lose Montgomery's. "Maybe we should hear them out," Franklin suggested reluctantly. "At least see what they're offering." Richard looked up in surprise. "You think we should sell, after everything?" "I think we should know all our options," Franklin replied, carefully, "before the bank makes the decision for us." Later that afternoon, Melissa's brother Craig arrived at Montgomery's with Martin Holloway, the businessman interested in purchasing the property. Richard had agreed to meet them during the lull between lunch and dinner service, with Franklin insisting on being present as well. "Richard, good to see you," Craig greeted, his sales persona firmly in place. "This is Martin Holloway, CEO of Urban Plate Concepts." Holloway was precisely what Richard had expected. Expensive suit, practiced smile, the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Montgomery, I've heard excellent things about your establishment's history. Family-owned restaurants have such character." The slight pause before character told Richard everything he needed to know about Holloway's true thoughts on independent restaurants. "We thought we might discuss business over lunch," Craig suggested. "Let Martin experience Montgomery's firsthand." Richard nodded stiffly. "Franklin and I have prepared a special menu for today, if you'll follow me." They settled at the best table in the house, a corner spot with a view of both the bustling kitchen and the elegant dining room. Franklin remained in the kitchen, preparing their meal while Richard played host. "We'll start with my mother's corn bisque," Richard explained as servers delivered the first course. "A family recipe that's been on our menu for 30 years. Holloway tasted the soup, his eyebrows rising in genuine appreciation. "Exceptional depth of flavor. Your chef has a remarkable touch." "That would be my brother, Franklin," Richard replied, watching Holloway's reaction carefully. "He's been crucial to our recent culinary renaissance." As the meal progressed through each carefully selected course, Richard noticed how each dish represented a chapter of his family's history. The bisque, from their mother. The roasted vegetables prepared exactly as their father had taught them. The handmade pasta reflecting techniques Franklin had mastered during his years working in Italian restaurants. For dessert, Franklin emerged from the kitchen carrying a perfect apple tart, setting it personally before their guests. "My mother's recipe," he stated simply, with a few adaptations my niece Emma suggested. Through each course, Holloway had grown increasingly impressed, while Craig shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing his sure deal slipping away. When Franklin returned to the kitchen, Holloway leaned forward. "Remarkable meal, truly. You've created something special here," he acknowledged. "But sentimentality aside, the numbers don't lie. You're facing foreclosure within weeks." Richard remained silent as Holloway pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "My offer is generous, well above market value. You could walk away debt-free with a substantial sum to start something new." "Something new," Richard repeated, opening the folder. The figure was indeed impressive, enough to clear their debts and start fresh. "And what happens to Montgomery's?" Holloway spread his hands. "Rebranding, renovation. We'd keep elements of the historical charm, of course, but update the concept to appeal to a broader demographic." "You mean destroy everything that makes it special," Richard translated. "I mean make it profitable," Holloway countered smoothly. "Your family's legacy is admirable, but business is business. This location has tremendous potential with the right concept." Richard closed the folder. "And my staff? My brother?" "We retain top talent whenever possible," Holloway replied carefully, "though management changes are typically necessary during transitions." As their guests departed, promising to give Richard time to consider the offer, Franklin emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Well, the number's good," Richard admitted. "Better than I expected." "But," Franklin prompted, recognizing the conflict in his brother's voice. "But this place isn't just a building or a business," Richard said, gesturing around the dining room. "It's 30 years of my life. It's our parents' legacy. It's where you and I found each other again." Franklin nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. "So we keep fighting." Back in the kitchen, a heated discussion erupted. Franklin, despite his earlier suggestion to hear Holloway out, now firmly opposed selling to the franchise developer. "He'd gut everything that makes this place special," Franklin argued, echoing Richard's earlier thought. "Turn it into another soulless corporate establishment." "We may not have a choice," Richard countered, playing devil's advocate despite his own misgivings. "The bank won't budge and we're running out of time." "There has to be another way," Franklin insisted, his normally reserved demeanor giving way to passionate determination. "Something we haven't considered." Their disagreement continued as they prepared for the evening service, the tension drawing curious glances from the staff. It was the first time the brothers had openly disagreed since Franklin's identity had been revealed. "Your family needs security," Franklin argued as they worked side by side. "Emma's college fund, Melissa's peace of mind, those matter more than brick and mortar." "This isn't just about the building," Richard shot back. "It's about what we've built here together, what we could still build." The argument paused when Melissa arrived unexpectedly, bringing Emma with her. "We need to talk," she announced, her expression revealing she'd already heard about Holloway's offer from Craig. After closing, the four of them gathered in Richard's office, a family meeting to determine their future. Emma sat quietly, unusually serious as the adults discussed options. "Craig says the offer expires in 3 days," Melissa explained, "before the bank's final decision." "Designed to force our hand," Richard noted bitterly. "It's still a good offer," Melissa reminded him gently. "We'd be debt-free with a cushion to start something new." Franklin remained silent, observing the family dynamic. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone. "What if there was another way?" he suggested quietly. "Something beyond refinancing or selling to Holloway?" All eyes turned to him expectantly. "What if," Franklin continued, choosing his words carefully, "we organized a special event? One night. Invitation only. Showcase the best of Montgomery's to potential investors who might appreciate what this place really means." "A Hail Mary pass," Richard said, considering the idea. "More like a last stand," Franklin corrected. "One night to show everyone why this place deserves to survive." Melissa's expression brightened. "It could work. We have connections through the restaurant, loyal customers with resources, food critics who've praised your recent collaboration, even local celebrities who've dined here." We'd need to make it exclusive, Richard mused, warming to the concept. Special menu, limited seating, personal invitation only. I can help, Emma piped up, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I could create a presentation about Montgomery's history, show everyone why it matters. As the family brainstormed into the night, a plan began to take shape. They would host an exclusive fundraising dinner, not merely seeking a single investor, but potentially multiple investors who valued the restaurant's heritage and future potential. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Jessica leveraged her extensive contact list to identify potential investors among their regular clientele. Richard reached out to food critics who had praised the restaurant's recent renaissance. Franklin threw himself into designing a menu that would showcase not only their culinary skills, but the story of their family. It's ambitious, Jessica warned, reviewing their growing guest list. Even if this works, there's no guarantee we'll raise enough to satisfy the bank. It's our best shot, Richard replied, determined. The night before the event, Richard found Franklin alone in the kitchen, methodically testing and retesting elements of the special menu. His brother had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, focused with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Everything okay? Richard asked, noting the tension in Franklin's shoulders. Just ensuring tomorrow goes perfectly, Franklin replied without looking up from his work. We've done everything we can, Richard said. The rest is up to our guests. Franklin finally stopped, turning to face his brother. There's something you should know, he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a worn envelope. If tomorrow doesn't work, Richard accepted the envelope, opening it to find property documents for a small parcel of land in the countryside, about an hour outside the city. I bought it years ago, Franklin explained hesitantly. During a brief period of stability. Just an old farmhouse with some land, nothing special. But it's paid for, free and clear. Richard looked up in surprise. You own property? All this time? It's the only thing I've ever owned, Franklin admitted. Kept it as a safety net, I guess. Somewhere to go if everything else failed. Understanding dawned on Richard's face as he examined the deed. This is your plan B. Franklin nodded, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. If tomorrow doesn't work, if we lose Montgomery's, we could start something new, something smaller, just family. The land has good soil for growing produce. Richard stared at his brother, deeply moved by this revelation. After decades of keeping nothing, owning nothing, committing to nothing, Franklin had created a contingency plan not just for himself, but for both of them. For a new beginning of the Montgomery brothers if this one fails, Franklin added quietly, nodding toward the envelope in Richard's hand. Richard stared at the envelope in his hands, overwhelmed by the significance of Franklin's gesture. After decades of keeping nothing, owning nothing, Franklin had quietly held on to this property, not just as his own escape hatch, but as a final option for both of them. You'd really start over with me? Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. Franklin looked away, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of the moment. It's just land, he muttered. Nothing special. But they both knew it was much more than that. It was Franklin's only anchor in a life spent adrift, and he was offering to share it. We won't need it, Richard said firmly, handing the envelope back. Tomorrow will work. It has to. The morning of the fundraising gala dawned clear and crisp. Richard arrived at Montgomery's before sunrise, finding Franklin already there, meticulously checking each ingredient for the evening's menu. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, each focused on their tasks with the precision that had become their shared language. Nervous? Richard asked, as staff began to arrive. Franklin's hands never paused as he assembled delicate pastry shells. I don't get nervous in kitchens. This isn't just any night in the kitchen. It's exactly that, Franklin countered. The food speaks for itself, Always has. Jessica burst through the doors an hour later, clipboard in hand and determination in her stride. Final head count is 32 confirmed guests, she announced, including representatives from 3 investment firms, 2 acclaimed food critics, and the bank manager. The bank manager? Richard echoed, surprised. I thought they'd already made up their minds. I can be persuasive, Jessica replied with a tight smile. Told him it would be poor form to miss the opportunity to see what he might be foreclosing on. As morning turned to afternoon, Montgomery's transformed. Tables were rearranged to create an intimate dining space centered around the restaurant's heart. Emma arrived. After school, immediately setting up the display she had created, a timeline of Montgomery's history, complete with photographs of Richard's parents, the restaurant's opening day, and candid shots of the brothers working together in the kitchen. This looks incredible, Richard told his daughter, admiring her work. You've captured everything that matters about this place. Not everything, Emma replied, carefully placing a final photograph on the board, a recent image of Franklin teaching her to make cinnamon rolls. Family is what matters most. As the staff prepared for the evening, Melissa arrived carrying garment bags. Fresh shirts for both of you, she explained. And Franklin, I had your suit tailored. The one you wore to Emma's recital was a bit large. Franklin accepted the garment bag with evident discomfort. You didn't need to. Yes, I did, Melissa interrupted gently. Tonight isn't just about impressing investors. It's about showing them who the Montgomery brothers really are. In the small office that doubled as a changing room, Richard found himself adjusting Franklin's tie, a strangely intimate moment between brothers who had missed decades of such ordinary interactions. You clean up well, Richard commented, stepping back to appraise his brother. Almost unrecognizable from the man I found in the alley. Franklin grimaced at his reflection. Feel like I'm playing dress-up. You're not playing anything, Richard assured him. You're a Montgomery. This is who you always were beneath everything else. As the first guests began to arrive, Richard took a moment alone at the bar, steadying his nerves with deep breaths. Everything they had worked for, not just in the frantic days of preparation, but throughout his entire career, hinged on the next few hours. Quite the transformation, said a voice behind him. Richard turned to find the bank manager, Harold Winters, surveying the restaurant with clinical detachment. Mr. Winters, Richard greeted, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Professional curiosity, Winters replied, his handshake perfunctory. Though I should warn you, Mr. Montgomery, the bank's position remains unchanged. Tonight's event is unlikely to alter our timeline. Before Richard could respond, Melissa appeared at his side, elegant in a deep blue dress. Mr. Winters, how lovely you could join us. Let me show you to your table. We've seated you with some fascinating guests I'm sure you'll enjoy meeting. As they moved away, Franklin emerged from the kitchen, looking uncharacteristically formal in his tailored suit. The bank still planning to pull the plug? He asked quietly. Apparently, Richard confirmed, but the night is young. The evening unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Each course told a story, not just of culinary excellence, but of the Montgomery legacy. Richard introduced each dish with brief anecdotes about their parents, their childhood, the traditions that had shaped their cooking. Between the third and fourth courses, Emma stepped forward to guide guests through her display, her natural enthusiasm captivating even the most serious-faced investors. My dad and uncle didn't just create recipes, she explained, pointing to old photographs. They preserved our family's stories through food. The main course, a reimagined version of their father's signature beef Wellington, earned audible murmurs of appreciation throughout the dining room. Richard caught Franklin's eye across the restaurant, exchanging a brief, hopeful smile. As dessert was being prepared, Jessica sidled up to Richard. The critic from the Tribune is writing notes on a napkin, she whispered. And I overheard one of the investment firm representatives asking about meeting privately after dinner. Hope flickered in Richard's chest, but he tempered it with caution, one step at a time. The dessert, a sophisticated interpretation of their mother's apple tart, was Franklin's creation, a perfect balance of nostalgia and innovation. As servers presented the final course, Richard prepared to address their guests one last time. Instead, Franklin stepped forward, taking everyone by surprise. "Before you enjoy dessert," Franklin began, his voice unusually steady despite the roomful of expectant faces, "I'd like to say something." A hush fell over the dining room. This wasn't part of their planned program. Richard held his breath, uncertain what his brother was about to do. "Many of you know Richard Montgomery," Franklin continued. "You've watched him build this restaurant over decades, turning a simple family dream into something extraordinary." Franklin paused, his eyes briefly meeting Richard's across the room. "What you may not know is that I'm his brother, Franklin Montgomery. For the past 5 years, I've worked in this kitchen, first as a dishwasher, then as a cook. But my connection to Montgomery's goes much deeper." The room remained silent as Franklin recounted their story, not the full, painful details, but enough to convey the brothers' separation, their decades apart, and their unexpected reunion in this very restaurant. "5 years ago I was homeless," Franklin stated plainly, his dignity unwavering despite the admission. "Richard found me behind this restaurant going through the garbage. He didn't recognize me. How could he? 30 years had passed. But he offered me work, a chance at dignity." Richard felt tears threatening as Franklin continued, describing his gradual return to cooking, his rediscovery of their family recipes, his growing connection to the restaurant that bore his name. "What makes Montgomery's special isn't the building or even the food," Franklin concluded, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It's the way this place connects people through shared experiences. The way a meal can become a memory, a tradition, a legacy. That's what my brother understood all along, and what I've finally come to understand too." As Franklin returned to the kitchen, the room erupted in applause. Richard caught Winter's expression. The banker's clinical detachment had given way to something approaching thoughtfulness. Later, as guests lingered over coffee and dessert, small groups formed around the restaurant. Richard found himself engaged in earnest conversation with 2 potential investors, while Franklin surprisingly fielded questions from the food critics who had sought him out in the kitchen. Near midnight, as the last guest departed, the exhausted staff gathered around the bar. Jessica distributed champagne, her expression cautiously optimistic. "3 solid investment offers," she announced. "Plus, the Tribune critic wants to feature the Montgomery brothers' story in a special edition." "And Winters?" Richard asked, looking for the banker who had slipped out without saying goodbye. "Left his card," Melissa replied, sliding it across the bar. "With a note to call him tomorrow. Said something about reconsidering terms." The champagne flowed as they celebrated this tentative victory. Franklin remained quieter than the others, observing the jubilation with his characteristic reserve. When the staff had finally departed, leaving only family, Richard approached his brother in the now silent kitchen. "You surprised me tonight," he said. "I didn't expect you to tell our story." Franklin shrugged, loosening his tie. "Figured if we're going down, might as well go down honestly." "We're not going down," Richard assured him. "Thanks to you." In the quiet aftermath, as they cleaned the last of the evening's dishes, Franklin paused, water dripping from his hands. "Even if this works, even if we save the restaurant, there's something I need to know." "What's that?" Richard asked. "Is there really room for 2 Montgomerys running this place? We're both used to being in charge." Richard smiled, reaching for a towel to dry his hands. "I've been thinking about that. What would you say to changing the name?" "To what?" Richard gestured toward the front window, where the old Montgomery sign had hung for 3 decades. To Montgomery Brothers. Make it official. Franklin stared at his brother, a complex emotion crossing his weathered face. I don't deserve that. It's not about deserving, Richard replied, his voice gentle but firm. It's about belonging.